Our reading from the Gospels this morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. Jesus is speaking with his disciples. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The desert can be a thin place. Thin place? Is that a phrase you've heard before? And if so, have you wondered about its meaning? The whole idea of thin places is as ancient as the book of Genesis, where Jacob wrestled with the stranger while on his way to seek forgiveness and restoration from his brother Esau. In the world of spirituality today, thin places seem to have arisen out of a renewed interest in Celtic spirituality, an early form of Christian spirituality, where thin places play a significant role. The desert can be a thin place. For those who have awakened to a more profound sense of the divine in their lives, it is not unknown for them to have adopted and adapted the phrase thin place. Traditionally, if it can even be spoken of as traditionally, when speaking of thin place, a thin place is a place where the boundary between heaven and earth is especially thin. It's a place where we can sense the divine more readily. The desert can be a thin place. The story Meredith read this morning from the book of Acts of the Apostles is a curious one, filled with the unexpected. Philip chancing upon an individual riding along on a wilderness road in the desert. Why Philip? Why not Peter or Paul, the two major protagonists in the book of the Acts? We know almost nothing about Philip, yet here he is, the star of this show. And what about the other character? Luke could hardly describe a more unique and unusual character. Treasurer for Candace. Candace, the queen of Ethiopia, which was a matriarchy and not a patriarchy, which means he probably had darker skin. He had been to Jerusalem and was riding on a chariot, able to read. And he actually has a copy of the book of Isaiah. Can you imagine how rare and priceless that must have been? Oh, and I forgot. He was a eunuch. The desert can be a thin place. Do you have a thin place? Somewhere you sneak off to when you want to be closer to God? One of those places where the chasm between God and you recedes and the presence of God is palpable? The desert was a thin place for Moses, where up on the side of a mountain he saw a bush which appeared to be on fire. The desert was a thin place for Jesus, who after his baptism spent 40 days and nights in the wilderness. The desert can be a thin place. Do you have a thin place? Perhaps it is the summer camp where somehow faith seemed more real, community felt more comfortable, and God seemed as close as your next breath. Perhaps it's a room in your home, a chair, a couch, where God speaks in the stillness or the noise of the day. Perhaps it's in a parking lot filled with families, children with painted faces, wearing derby hats they made themselves. The desert can be a thin place. But a thin place need not be a place at all. I think, and of course whenever I say that it means that I'm not an expert, I think a place, a thin place, can also be a state of heart, a state of mind, a state of soul. One can travel the world to the places others have designated as thin places and never catch a whiff of the divine. I think thin places occur when we least expect it, when we have almost given up hope, when life has become difficult and perhaps we are living in pain, when we are searching for something and we can't even give it a name. Hope to become something that we cannot even imagine, and our striving has left us exhausted. The desert can be a thin place. So Philip ends up hopping up onto the chariot and finds the Ethiopian in a thin place. A thin place reading Isaiah, trying to understand it, trying to make it personal, looking for a connection, and coming up short. Wishing that someone would explain it to him so that somehow he could understand. He was hoping that his struggle for connection could come to an end. A thin place on a wilderness road, reading his Bible. He knows where he's to be. He knows what he's to read. But even in the desert with the prophets writing, the Ethiopian is lost. The desert can be a thin place. Yesterday, as I greeted people who found their way to our parking lot for a little fun, a little food, a little shade, I struck up a conversation with a person who I think was in a thin place. Her child was getting ready to graduate from high school, and she was afraid. She was afraid for her child, for the choices she might make. Her own health was such that she never knew for certain how she would feel today until today. The nest was emptying, and she was going to be home alone. She loved her child, but she was ready to kick this person out. The wonderful, talented, athletic, smart person she had raised was turning into someone she didn't know, someone she didn't really like. She was afraid. And right there, on our parking lot skirt, between the parking lot and Broadway, was her thin place. So I hopped on her chariot, and off we went, never moving an inch. The desert can be a thin place. Last week I shared a thin place in my life. Perhaps it actually was a place that was thin, a place where the boundary between heaven and earth was literally thin. I mean, someone named that place Inspiration Point. And people keep climbing that hill. But I feel certain that more times than not, what people experience is not really all that thin. Just a view of the lake and a few pine trees. But for me, that thin place was a desert spring. It really was a thin place for the Ethiopian, literally and figuratively. And when, with Philip's help, he encountered the one who loved him, who called him by name, the desert wilderness gave way to a desert spring, an oasis, a baptismal pool, where God's Spirit descended like a dove. And the voice from heaven spoke, as that voice can only speak in thin places, "You are my beloved." And he was changed. A thin place can be a desert spring. Perhaps you find yourself in the desert of despair or in a wilderness of uncertainty. Or perhaps you're just looking for a deeper relationship, something more profound. The problems before you can seem insurmountable. The issues you may be facing may seem daunting. You may feel all by yourself, that no one knows what you're going through, and worse, no one cares. Perhaps like the Ethiopian, you have even turned to the Bible. Imagine that. Looking for answers, hoping to find help. Still, you feel alone on an island of uncertainty, and you despair. But you're not alone. You're surrounded by a community who cares. A community who doesn't always get it right, but always tries. I know this. Just as there was a Philip for the Ethiopian, there is a friend for you too. Now, I know I was not like Philip, not able to interpret her place in the unending story of God's love in a life-transforming way. But for a moment, just a moment, we stopped at a desert spring, and two strangers tasted a bit of cool water. I don't know if I helped her. I don't know if I gave her hope. I don't know that I provided her with peace. We did talk about God and how some people think of God as, in her words, the genie in the bottle, anxious for us to have everything that we want. And as a person with a debilitating illness and a prodigal daughter, she couldn't see God anywhere, let alone providing her with a new house or a better car, as her friends had said God would. If there is a God at all, she said, I don't think He cares about day-to-day life. I don't think He cares about me. She just couldn't see God jumping in or doing anything at all, for a matter of fact. And I agreed. I agreed about God jumping in. We talked about God not playing favorites, but rather favoring to work through people. People like Philip. People like you. People like me. People who happened into our life. And perhaps just for a moment, in that moment, that thin place where we were washed, our thirst quenched, and we were baptized in the love of God, is right there. Wherever it might be, even on the skirt of a parking lot with hundreds of people around. God favors to work through people, through family and friends, through the church. It's not that God doesn't care enough to intervene. It's that God cares enough to not intervene. It's that God cares enough to allow us to be His eyes and His ears and His hands and His love. To step into that chariot and to ride along with that person for a moment in time and to share our life story and interpret it in relationship to the love of God. God cares enough to favor us, trusting that when someone who is searching for a thin place, trusting that when someone who is searching for a thin place will cross one of our lives, and that we will step up and be a cup of cool water. You see, sometimes a thin place is really a desert pool.